Hi, and welcome to Talkin' Sunday Readings. Thank you for joining us. I am once again here with Pastor Dick Stadler and with Ann Carter, and we're going to be talking about the readings that you might hear in churches this coming Sunday, which is the 24th Sunday in Pentecost. Those readings are going to be from 1 Kings chapter 17, a reading from Hebrews chapter 9, and then a gospel lesson from Mark chapter 12.
A reading from 1 Kings. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath, in the region of Sidon, and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there, gathering sticks. He called her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar, so that I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and for your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day, for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah.
We'll kick things off here with Kings, 1 Kings. And as usual, just like to start with a couple of questions. This is a very interesting story about, Elijah, and he comes across a widow, and he asks her to bake him some bread, and she does. And I guess my first question is about bread itself and about what they were making. She's very, very poor. She's destitute. And she says all she has is a little bit of flour and a little bit of olive oil. And that made me wonder, what kind of bread was she making with a little bit of flour and a little bit of olive oil? And let's start there. What can you guys tell me about bread and what kind of bread they might have been making?
Go ahead, Ann, if you know something about bread baking.
Okay, well, most flatbreads are made with a little bit of leavening agent, but the ingredients are very simple. It's flour, it's water. It's flour, it's a fat, it's water, salt, and then a little leavener. But you can make just a basic flatbread, like a tortilla, out with just, I found a recipe today for a Lebanese flatbread that is flour, olive oil, and a pinch of salt.
Mhm.
So it's a very rudimentary, basic flatbread that would be mixed together, kneaded, put in balls, rolled flat, and then baked. And some cultures, I know the Northern African, some of the Northern African countries, they have this almost an inverted kettle, and they get it really hot, and they put the bread on top of it, and then it fries up, and then they use it like we would use a fork. So they would have a stew or something, and they would dip the bread into it and then eat the bread and eat the stew. That's what I believe she was probably making, as something very simple, very basic.
Very
probably
simple.
didn't have any meat, I'm sure. So this was going to be it.
Yeah.
They have been in drought for several years, and now she's down to absolutely the last bit, and she's expecting that she and her son are going to die. And so she's just, it's interesting. It's tragic. It's fascinating.
From the little a reading I did, I found out that by mixing the oil in with the flour, it actually preserves the bread from going stale as fast as it would without the oil. So it kind of increases the shelf life of the bread, So there may have been a practical reason for having the oil there and needing the oil to be nonstop.
Mhm.
But it is interesting that why does God say in the 9th verse, I have commanded a widow there to feed you?
Mhm.
This is the total reverse of the cultural expectations, that it was the people's job to take care of the widows. That's why Israel had the law of gleaning. They had to leave the corners of their fields unharvested for the widow, the orphan, the sojourner. And so how would this woman, how did God communicate to her? I got my man coming. His name's Elijah. He's going to ask you for bread. Give it to him. We don't know how he communicated with her, if she was even a believer before this episode. So there's just a lot of unanswered questions, So we're going to look for hints maybe in the text before the story's over.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, how did God come to Ananias and tell him that Saul had lost his sight and that he was in a room praying, and that Ananias was going to go, that God was sending Ananias to give Saul his sight back, and Saul knew that Ananias was going to come? How does that work?
Yeah, we just aren't told a lot of specifics. And so all we do know is that God did it. And that may explain why when Elijah sees her at the city gate gathering up sticks, apparently for the fire, he recognizes who she is, that she's the widow that God had selected, and he tells her, make the bread. And maybe that was the test, is that if you said, give me this bread, and she says, yeah, then that's the indication that's the right one. And how did he know she's a widow?
Color of clothes?
With the story, yeah, it could be the clothes, because Tamar, when she decides she's going to stop being a widow and seduce her father-in-law, Judah, she takes off her widow's clothes, the text says. And so there must have been a classic or culturally expected way for widows to dress after their husbands died. And so at least they would narrow the field by looking for the widow in the widow's dress. But then when he tells her what he needs and she just responds so positively, that's probably the second into confirmation for Elijah. That's the one God was talking about. He picked her, and he communicated somehow with her. Yeah.
It's interesting going back and looking a little bit before this story in the text. God tells Elijah that there's going to be this drought, and to announce it to King Ahab, which he does. And then he goes and he lives by a brook on the east side of the Jordan River, and ravens feed Elijah. So God is really taking care of Elijah, first with ravens and the water in the brook, and then he sends Elijah up to this place called Zarephath in Sidon. And interestingly, I found this interesting, Ahab's wife, Jezebel, who is the source of lots of problems in these next chapters, is from Sidon. So God sends his prophet from safety right into almost would you call it the hornet's nest, or is he hiding in?
Sure, it's a citadel. That's the citadel of Baal worship. That's for sure, because she's the one who imported Baal worship. Would you like to see a map, just so you can kind of get a picture of where that is? I found a really simple map that really is very graphic there. Can you see that? Okay. And so Zarephath is right up here, and he was down here at the Kerith Brook on the east side of the Jordan River, and God had told him to get over there after he read the riot act to King Ahab, probably for his own safety. But then he says, now go up and see this widow that I've got waiting for you. So he goes up along the Jordan Valley, and this confirms when we talked some weeks ago about the Syrophoenician woman that Jesus visited. Jesus comes to almost the same area to heal her daughter. And Anne had mentioned that when Jesus finished there, he may have taken this river valley which also coincides with the way of the sea that goes all the way down the Mediterranean, but starts way up here in Syria, and then come down. And this map maker agrees with you, Anne, that more than likely this is the most natural route for him to take, is go all the way up the Jordan Valley past the Hula Basin and then cut over here in this river valley to Zarephath. So kind of fun to see that. Any questions before I take the map down?
I mean,
So,
what else? I guess I don't know this section well enough, but what else was he doing there aside from meeting up with this widow?
that's the only thing recorded.
Okay,
Waiting.
because that's a long way to go just to meet up with this widow.
Well, it may have been setting up Jesus, because the whole scriptures are about him, and God has a plan that he unveils bit by bit. So God sends his prophet Elijah up here as a kind of a parallel to what his son is going to do when his son comes up here to heal a Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Now, what we don't get this week in the reading is that this widow's son, after his life is saved with the oil and the bread and she's able to keep making for quite a while, miraculously, because of what Elijah has done for her, or God has done for her through Elijah, the son dies, and he brings it back to life. That's a whole nother story. Okay, and then Jesus will heal an unbeliever outside of Israel, and then he will come back into the land. Okay, so it's kind of interesting, the parallels.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Dick, could you show us where Carmel is? Because on a practical level, God could be positioning Elijah for the big battle of Baal prophets that's coming up. And so if he is up there at Zarephath, and if he came down the coast to Mount Carmel, then he would be in a position then to
this mountain ridge, I believe, on this map.
Yep,
I think
so
this is Mount Carmel. This is the valley of
it's the Jezreel Valley, isn't it?
Jezreel Valley, right? And so it'd be down in this. So he could, after coming up this route, to have followed the coastline down through the coastal plains and gotten to Carmel, because that's the next story. In chapter 18. Yep. Okay, I'll stop sharing here just there. But the geography is really fascinating in this story. Anything else that you think someone's going to ask, Tim, as they listen to this? No, it won't be effective in this story, but we're told in the next story that Elijah has been staying with this woman, that she's provided a room for him upstairs, either on the top of the roof, which they often did, or in a second floor. And so that's why he's available when her son dies. He's right there, and he takes him up into his room, lays on him, and he brings life. God brings life back into the boy. So fascinating.
A reading from Hebrews. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands, that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him.
No, I think we can keep rolling into Hebrews.
Okay.
That works for everybody, unless there's anything else. This is an interesting one. It's a fairly short passage. And from what I read as I read through it, or what I took away from it, is that this passage is sort of describing all the ways in which kind of Jesus is different from high priests of the past, or the kind of how people would define a priest in the past. And I guess what interests me is that this description of a priest, offering sacrifices and doing this and that, is not my current modern vision of a priest. I'm wondering what they were like back then. What was a priest like then, and what can we kind of look for in this, since we don't have the same point of reference that they did, that they were listening, that they were hearing back then. So what was a priest like, and what should we learn from this passage?
Remember the context for Israelite worship. God knew that they were all unholy people. He is a holy God. And for unholy people to try to get close to a holy God is sheer destruction. So he has provided a prescribed way that unholy people can safely get close to him. And that's through the sacrifices. Bring this sacrifice and you can get right close to God's house, which is the tabernacle and later the temple. And you come to me through the priesthood. You don't do this on your own. This is not a one-on-one relationship with Jesus. This is, you go through the priest to get to me. And the word for sacrifice that I like is korban, which means to approach or get close to. And that helped me when I read an opinion by a Jewish rabbi to understand why they could say that these did not offer forgiveness of sins. What they offered was the safe way for the Israelites who had been sinners to come close to a holy God without being destroyed by his holiness. And in the process of getting close to him, you hear him pronounce his blessing, because that was the other responsibility of priests, not just to offer sacrifices, but also to pronounce a blessing on the people. And so they would hear that God is a gracious, loving God. They would hear that God is a forgiving God and that God forgives them. But all of these sacrifices, the book of Hebrews is telling us here and throughout other chapters, were a picture of the supreme sacrifice that Jesus would offer. And unlike the priestly sacrifices that those priests offered every morning and every night for their whole lives, he only had to offer his sacrifice one time. And it effectively earned forgiveness for the whole world for all their sin. Now, that's just really a bumper sticker summary of what priests do. But and maybe there's some other things that you think might be worthwhile to toss in here.
Well, I think that Tim's point was well made, is that we just don't have any sort of a reference to understand really what the priests did. And Hebrews is that whole book that we need to learn about a culture before we can really apply what is being taught. And there's so much depth to it that, as you said, bumper sticker. I mean, there's so many layers to it, to understanding. I think you did a good job, and it's
there is a real worthwhile insight that he offers us in the last verse of this reading. Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, which is another way, the sins of all, he will appear a second time. So he comes first Advent as a baby in Bethlehem. Second Advent, he's coming back, not to deal with sin, because that's what he does when he sacrifices himself and dies for the sins of the world. On his second coming, to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. And so there's a great promise in this reading to remind us all that as we are getting close to the end of the church calendar, in the last couple Sundays of the church calendar, they will focus more and more on his second coming. And when he comes in judgment, we don't have to be afraid of that day, because he's coming back to offer salvation and to keep all of his promises. So this text says it pretty succinctly. Yeah.
Very good. Well, I think that's a great place then to
the Holy Gospel according to Mark. As he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on."
Transition into the Gospel of Mark. Here again, we hear about
A widow.
widows.
There's a tight connection between the Old Testament and this gospel.
Yeah, we don't always see that, so that was kind of nice to see. But we've heard them before, and now we're hearing them in the gospel. And I'm kind of wondering, how were widows treated in this time? I mean, the first widow was starving to death, and then in this one it describes, that the poor widow was, a victim or to people would take advantage of them in certain ways. And I'm wondering, what were they? How were they treated back then? How were they viewed? And sort of what was a widow's life like, I guess, in the time of Jesus? And I mean, in the time of the Old Testament as well, Kings, which is a huge swath of time that we're jumping between. But I'm just, what were widows like back then?
Well, there were some good provisions for widows. The gleaning rule that God gave to everybody who raised crops: leave grapes, leave grain in the corners of your fields. Don't grab every single last morsel. Leave that for the widow and for the orphan. So there were some social help programs that God mandated. Now, whether the people did that or not is a whole another question. And whether they were greedy and just took as much as they could to make as much money as they could and forgot about the widow, we just don't know. But apparently there were some religious people who were mistreating widows and the people that they were supposed to be taking care of, and others. And the word that's used for her in verse 42, that's translated usually as poor, literally means be destitute. This lady had nothing. And then on top of that, when she does put her offering in, just too little of the smallest coins that were available in those days, she gives, the text says, everything that she had. That means she had nothing left for tomorrow's bread or this evening's bread. So this was sacrificial giving of the nth degree. And Jesus points to her and says, see all those other people who are throwing their coins in? And by the way, the receptacles, the Gaza Fulakayan, was a trumpet-shaped thing that must have been made out of metal. And so when they took their coins and they threw them in, it would make a loud sound and advertise to everybody, oh, look how generous I am. I'm not just throwing in 1 or 2. I'm just throwing in a whole fistful. And Jesus says, those people didn't give as much as this lady did. And so he holds her up as a wonderful example. Yeah.
When a woman was in a marriage, she had economic stability because she had a husband who worked and she belonged to a family. But when the husband died, and if her husband's family didn't want her as part of their new family, she could take her. There was some money. In an ideal situation, there was some money that was set aside for her when she married. In case he died, then she'd have a living. But without a connection to the land, to a plot of land, or to a means of income, widows and orphans were really destitute. They were at the bottom of the heap. And over and over and over again, when Paul asks congregations for money, they always say, remember the widows and the orphans, remember the poor among you. James instructed Paul to remember the widows and orphans because they were truly the most vulnerable in society. They had nobody to take care of them. And if they were being taken advantage of, if they had to sell everything that they might have been able to take out of the marriage or keep, and they were being swindled, then they truly were oppressed. And Jesus looks out for them, or at least uses them as an example. The only entity that she had to take care of her was God. And she was relying on him completely for his care, and she gave everything that she had. And interestingly, God was sitting there and watched her give everything. And I can only hope that somehow, if she met a family, I know that Jesus took care of her. I don't know how, but I know that he met her needs.
Yeah, that's the question I want to ask Jesus the day after Judgment Day or the week after Judgment Day when I finally get in line. What did you do for her, Jesus, after you point her out as being destitute and giving everything away? Did you maneuver somebody into her life who could take care of her? Did you tell one of your disciples, like you did when you fed the 5,000 or 4,000, go get some food and take care of her? The text just doesn't tell us, because maybe it assumes that we would figure that the Jesus of love would somehow take care of this woman that he has identified as really destitute. Yeah. And that's my hope too, even though it doesn't say in the text. Yeah. Good thoughts.
Yeah. If there's any other last thoughts before we close out. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this week. We appreciate your viewership. Please like and subscribe, and share this with anybody you think might get something out of it, or share it with somebody who might need a little subsidizing of their Sunday worship. We appreciate you joining us. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Pastor Dick. And we'll see you all next week on Talking Sunday Readings.
Shalom.